I just picked up the keys to our long-term Volvo C40, and while I'm really looking forward to driving this over the next couple weeks, the only downside is I need to get it home. And while I picked this up in San Jose, California, I need to get it all the way up to the Pacific Northwest, which means electric car road trip. But I decided to make it just a little bit more interesting on my way home, because this week, at least the week I'm picking this up, Volvo just got access to the Tesla Supercharger network. And as you may be able to see, I'm here at my first Supercharger stop. So I just finished up filling up for the first time. I'm gonna go ahead and unplug, get this back on the road. I'll pick you up at my next stop, tell you how things have gone so far and what I expect over the next several hundred miles. All right, time to tell you how things started and what the plan is moving forward, because it has changed just a little bit. Instead of hitting the road and putting a bunch of miles behind me before dark, I ended up in about a 5-hour backup in the Bay Area, moving a total of about 3 miles. So needless to say, the actual scheduling has changed a bit, and I'm now gonna go ahead and make a bit more of a road trip of this and make a fun stop on my way home. But to get home, what I've done is use the car's onboard navigation, tell it where I'm going, what my different stops are gonna be, including this new fun stop on the way back, and let the car do the route planning for me, including all of my charging stops. The downside is that the car doesn't include any Tesla charging stations at this moment. So what I'm using is the Tesla app on my phone to go ahead and find the nearest alternate Tesla charger to what are most cases Electrify America stations. And it turns out they happen to be in a lot of the same places. In some cases, basically across the parking lot. So what I've done is pull up to those Tesla chargers and stay there approximately the same amount of time that the vehicle wanted me to stay at the other stations, all of them charging at essentially the same total speeds. That's been pretty easy going, except for I ran into one hiccup a little bit earlier, and that one's my fault. I was looking at Tesla Supercharger stations not in the right spot on the map, and I ended up at one that wouldn't let me use this system with my car. So luckily I had just enough battery to get to the next station down the road, but make sure you're going to a Tesla station that does support this app integration. So now that we're at our charging station, time to plug in. But to do so, we're gonna need to make sure we have the right adapter. And in this case, it's the CCS to NACS adapter. CCS is what the car came with. NACS is what we get at these Supercharger stations. So all we have to do is plug it in and then plug this into the native port on our Volvo, which luckily is here on the back left, because this charging location is exactly what you get on Tesla models. And the Tesla chargers were designed for that Tesla model, meaning these cables are basically only as long as they need to be, at least on this version 3. Version 4 gets a little bit longer cables and is gonna be easier for most other models. But we'll open our charge door here, pull out the CCS combo plug, and once we're plugged in, we are now done with the hardware side and we need to switch over to software. When I say software, I mostly mean your Tesla app. So I'm logged into mine. I'm gonna go ahead and select the charger that I'm at. That's gonna be this one here in Anderson, California. Charge here, and all it's gonna ask me is which stall I'm at. I believe I'm at 1 seat. We'll find if I have that correct. Click Start Charging, and in just a few seconds, it's gonna go ahead and start. Now, it will tell me how to get this process started, but luckily I've already gone ahead and gone through that myself. We'll see here on the screen that it's gonna kick in. And while it says initiated, it's actually already started. And slowly we're gonna go ahead and ramp up. But you'll also get that information here on the Tesla app. Now, as a Tesla owner, I don't know if this app ends up looking any different for folks who don't have a Tesla but are using these Superchargers. All I can tell you is that this is what it looks like on my end, and it happens pretty quickly. The other good news, at least at this point, is that we're starting at just about that max 150 kilowatts, which is fantastic because we always want to limit the amount of time we spend at these charging stations if we have to. Now, I didn't do any preconditioning, and I haven't been able to find a way to do that manually in the vehicle. What I have done is plugged in where we're heading, and again, had it assuming we're going to an EA or alternative station, but not always pulled into those on my end. So if it does any automatic battery conditioning, that's not something I can control, but if it is, we are still getting the benefit of it here on this end of things. We are starting at a low 24% battery, so this should stay on the higher end for most of the time, really. And I think we'll be here for another maybe 10-15 minutes, and then we will be up and over the mountain. But since I will be losing daylight, I'll probably go ahead and catch you tomorrow morning and just enjoy the rest of this drive in relative peace, at least hopefully. All right, before I get home, I figured I'd go ahead and show you how to unplug and disconnect from your charging session, which is arguably just as important as plugging it in the first place. So to do so, we're gonna start on our mobile app. Just like we did when we started the session, we're gonna activate it and disengage it from the Tesla app. Here on the screen, you can see that we're charging, our progress, our charging rate, and how much energy delivered. That is gonna be a low number because I plugged it back in to make sure I could grab this for you. To stop our charging, we're going to click Stop Charging. And that's going to tell this system that it's disengaging because the same safeties don't exist on the mechanical end of it. And now it's telling us the charging has stopped and what to do next. So I'm gonna go ahead, I'm going to press the button here on the top of the CCS adapter because that's how you would go ahead and disengage a CCS plug. But to disengage, the next thing I'm gonna do is flip on the underside here. And it may be a little bit difficult to see, but there is a release because the NACS connector, the Tesla connector, is released and secured here on the bottom. So pull that release down, disengage, hang this back up, put this away, tuck everything back where it was, and you are off on your way home. Now that's exactly what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna head home, get this plugged back in, charge it all the way up. That way we can take a look at all the numbers that we have available, how long it took, what our charging speeds were, and approximately how much electricity it took to get us from San Jose up here to the Pacific Northwest. I finally made it back home, which means I can dive into some of these numbers, and then on the back end, I'll go ahead and share some final thoughts and wrap everything up. But this trip ended up being about 853 total miles driven, and I am going to use some round numbers just to make both of our lives a little bit easier. In that 853 miles driven, I recharged about 335 kilowatt hours worth of electricity. On the road, I filled up about 261. At home, I got the remaining 74. And at home was a lot cheaper, as one would expect. My electricity is really inexpensive, so that 74 kilowatt hours only cost me about $5.50, which is a stone throw away from the $142 I spent on the other 261 kilowatt hours. That means that that was about 54 cents per kilowatt hour out on the road, and while it certainly could be worse, it wouldn't hurt if it was a little bit better. I did my very best to go ahead and mimic the stops the vehicle wanted me to make, but as I mentioned, the Tesla Supercharger network is not built into the Volvo at this time, at least not the Volvo that we have. So what I did is plotted my entire course, let the vehicle do all the math, and then I tried to mimic it with the nearest supercharger station, and that ended up working out pretty well. And the only thing I really changed was I added a few minutes at my last stop, which ended up cutting off one more stop on the way home. It was about a 5 or 10 minute stop that it wanted me to make, and I was actually having dinner at the time, so it just made sense to go ahead and hold over. But what I didn't do is time up my meals with most of these stops. Admittedly, that last day I knew it was going to be a longer stop, and the service at the diner was a little bit slower than I meant it to, but it was still good food, so ultimately all worth it. But the range was from about 8 minutes to 45 minutes, which is a pretty large range. And you can see, if you want to do some extra math, basically the average charge rate that I got based on how much energy I had while I was there. But here's one of the reasons this C40 is not going to be your ultimate road trip champion. Is first and foremost going to be the charge rate, because it's not terribly quick. At 150 kilowatts, that really is kind of the bare standard. And I also wasn't able to, at least that I could tell, precondition the vehicle to make things happen a little bit faster or survive a little bit longer before ultimately cutting down that charge rate. And the charge rate does drop pretty quickly. When you get towards 50%, you are unlikely to see three figures when it comes to the charging rate, and down at the, up at the 80% range, 70 to 80%, we're down below 50 kilowatts. And that means that we're really crawling, which ultimately means those 45 and 42 minute stops are not going to be the most efficient. But again, I only did the last one there to go ahead and limit a whole other stop, and that ended up working just fine for me. Although if you remember the 74 kilowatt hours I put back into this battery, you can tell I got home with not a whole lot of extra battery range available, so that one was a little bit tight. That's the other issue run into with this car, is that it doesn't have a very large battery, although admittedly it is not a very large car. But the newer versions, the EX40 and the EC40, are going to be better road trip options because they've got more range, they've got more efficiency. Although we don't have an enormous boost in charging speeds, those two are still going to benefit you. And ultimately, the 3 hours that I ended up stopping, or right about 3 hours that I ended up stopping for charging, I feel like is a pretty reasonable amount of time to add to what was supposed to be a 15-hour trip. Admittedly, I'm going to leave the total trip time out because I did not do that very efficiently. I was dealing with my own business, trying to make sure I gathered the data for you, and ran into that 5-hour gridlock. So needless to say, things were a lot longer than they should have been. But what should have been a 15-hour road trip adding 3 additional hours for your EV charging seems pretty reasonable, especially when you are not going to be making that drive very often. And admittedly, in the last few years, I made it a lot more than I expect, but it turns out our office is down in the Bay Area, and every once in a while, I make a drive down there. Also, for what would end up being an 18-hour trip, all math combined, that's a good one to break up into 2 days anyway. And if you want to get there faster, that's what airplanes are for. So if this is a car you're considering, or any electric car that you're considering, because again, this is not going to be the prime example of EV charging for a road trip, it's enough for me to say that as long as you don't do this very often, I don't think there's any real downside to it. Because obviously it's going to be not as cheap as it is to charge when you're at home, but it's not like it's 3 to 4 times the cost of gasoline for the very few occasions that you ultimately end up doing it. When it comes to specifically using the superchargers for this non-Tesla vehicle, I think it worked pretty much flawless. Again, the only hiccup was my own because I was using this weird little system to go ahead and make the trip work, but anyone else who used any other system would probably end up with a slightly better result. And the best result would be the superchargers being integrated into the Volvo software, which I imagine is coming in the not too distant future. The thing is, the superchargers, in my experience as a Tesla owner and using them here, have never been down. And not to say never ever, I've had 1 or 2 hiccups, but really they can be considered anomalies because of how consistent the supercharger network has been in its operation. The same can't be said, at least in my experience, and I know many others, when you're using other charging networks. And that's something that I'm going to go ahead and find out on my way back, because this vehicle is not just going to magically disappear. I'm going to have to go ahead and take it back to the Bay Area. And for that trip, I will use the car's onboard navigation. I will make those stops as it requests, and we'll see if I run into any hiccups. Obviously, I hope I don't, but I'm expecting to run into a few more than I did here, which ultimately ended up being 0 that were not forced errors by myself. If you have any questions about this trip, or this Volvo, as I will have it for the next few weeks, or want me to look ahead for something for that road trip on the way back, please let me know down in the comment section below. Any other thoughts, questions, comments, or concerns can be left there as well. Thank you so much for watching. Hope you enjoyed the video. Until next time, I'll see you down the road.